The GPS DairyCAST features the high-value insights of the GPS Dairy Consulting team's trusted advisors and the owners and managers from the elite dairy farms they serve. These conversations deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders.
Hello and welcome to the GPS DairyCAST. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, serving as your host today, coming to you from the 2023 GPS Leaders Forum. And coming off the stage is Michael Johnson from Trailside Holsteins in Fountain, Minnesota. Michael just shared with an audience the details of how he bridges culture and fosters employee relations at his dairy, and including a trip that he made to Mexico to visit the villages where some of his employees come from. He's joined by Stephanie Jens to dig into the details from this great conversation today at the 2023 GPS Leaders Forum.
Well, Michael, thanks so much for joining us at our 2023 Leaders Forum this year. We're really happy to have you as a speaker. And I'm hoping you can start us off by giving us a little bit of background about your farm.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, GPS, for having me and hosting me this great event. Trailside Holsteins started in the late 1970s when my mom and dad began farming on our home farm that we milk on right now in Fountain, Minnesota. When they moved there, they were young and ambitious, and they had 6 cows and one Alice Chalmers tractor and a feed mill, and began with not very much. But for the next 20 years, they milked 40 cows in a tie stall barn and raised 5 kids. And in the late 90s, around 98, it was needed to have a decision made to either go to a different type of business, and it was looking at beef production at the time, or to expand. And the decision was to continue with dairy farming and expand the farm. And with that came our first freestall barn, and we converted the tie stall barn to a parlor and holding area. And then we have grown kind of internally since then. But with that growth in the late 90s and with the parlor, that instead of all the family doing the labor, with growth comes changes, and one of those changes was outside labor and hiring employees. And so for the first few years, employees were kind of a secondary thought, and whoever we could find to work locally who would show up, high schoolers, some relatives, some local neighbors, and converted to, as the farm grew, wanted to milk 3 times a day, so then we added another shift. And it kind of made our employee situation even more complex, getting people to work late at night and not able to do as much of the work. The shifts spread out. So as this grew and the shifts became more and the hours became more, it was a challenge with employees. And in the mid-2000s, we hired our first employee from Mexico. And his name was Sosimo. He turned out to be a great employee, a great asset to us. And from there on, we basically hired from within. As we grew and as we added employees, we added more employees from Mexico.
That's great. And were they all from a similar area in Mexico that you were able to get them from, or all over?
Yeah, for the most part at the beginning, they were all from a similar area, a similar village, kind of word of mouth. Osmo hired a family member and then a friend, or helped us locate other employees. So yeah, and that helped with on-farm relations too. They kind of already knew of each other, had similar, attributes, work ethic, styles. And looking back and kind of retrospectively why this worked so well for our farm, having the employees from Mexico and getting to know them, like they experience very similar values as us as dairy farmers or Midwest people had. And, those being strong family values, a work ethic, and they're frugal people, and they valued, or they grew up in an agriculture setting. They grew up having a few animals, growing crops. And so they kind of already had that background, which is getting harder and harder to find locally. Absolutely. And I feel like as farmers, we have a harder time relating to our neighbors locally than we do with these Hispanic employees. So it's just a great relationship culturally and values-wise working together.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you guys did within your farm to really build those relationships with these employees and, learn more about how to work best with them?
Yeah, so as we added more employees and added cows, and managing employees is a different type of mindset than managing cows. And my dad is one of the best cow people out there and a great dairy farmer, but communicating and managing employees was not his his strong suit, not something he enjoyed and not something he was very well versed at. So as we had employees, I saw that we needed to really focus on this. And it was kind of one of my big things when I joined the farm full time and decided to become part of the business was, we need to stop looking at these employees as kind of a stressor or a negative, not against us kind of, and more looking at them as like, this is our business. They're a very, very important part of they're an asset to our business. I had some ambitious goals and I really wanted to grow and reach some new levels. And so I knew if I needed to do that, I couldn't do the work myself. And so we had to get our employees on board and make them take ownership and really find explain the whys of what we're doing and have them buy into our plan. Then you have this communication barrier, which you can't just go in and have conversations sometimes when maybe you can get your point across using translate or using what little Spanish or what little English they might know, but it's not an ends all. You can get things across, but it does add a complex thing. And so we began having meetings, and actually having the translator probably was a positive. It kind of forced us to have meetings and sit down and talk. Mm-hmm. So we bring in a translator in the beginning almost on a regular monthly basis and talk through some issues we might be having or some changes we want to make.
I think absolutely they can explain the situations a little bit better as well, and then that allows you to get more details. But what a great way, to have an investment into your people than to, if you aren't able to fluently speak, have that translator there so that they can really get their point across. That's a great idea. I wanted to dig into, Michael, a little bit. You shared about a trip that you had taken during your presentation here, and I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that and kind of where that came from, what your goals were behind that trip, and I'd love to hear a little more about that.
So this past February in 2023, I had the opportunity to travel to Mexico and visit some of the families and the communities of my employees. And I guess probably that started a long time ago when we started having these meetings 10 plus years ago and learning a little more about my employees. Every meeting I would encourage one employee to give a little talk about himself, like where he came from, a little hobbies, about his family. And so through that, we kind of started to learn a little more about their culture and about them. And that was really just intriguing to me of how we all live in the same world, but how just being born in a different part of the world and how different your upbringing can be and how that affects your mindset, your values. It was really interesting. So we were working with Translator, and they had an organization known as, or with the name of Puentes Bridges, which Puentes is bridges in Spanish. So it's just bridges. But it was about, basically the goal of the organization is to bridge the gap between employees from Mexico and dairy farmers in the Midwest. And it started in the early 2000s with very simple, humble beginnings, basically just wanting to train. There was farmers having issues communicating, so they were going to learn Spanish. And they decided the best way to learn Spanish quickly was to do a immersion trip to Mexico. And so they planned this immersion trip in 2001 and went to Mexico with the goal to hopefully learn the language a little better. And one day they took an afternoon trip out to a rural village where they had an opportunity to meet a few families. And through that interaction with the families and meeting some of the relatives of their employees, when they came back to the U.S., they quickly realized, or on the way home, they were like, that was by far the most impactful part of the trip. Learning the language was interesting, and I think it's a valuable tool, but meeting their families, that was life-changing. And so one of the farmers that was on that trip, John Rosenau, decided it was so important to him or so impactful that he's like, this needs to continue. I want other people to share this. I want to do this again. So him and along with Sean Duvall, who was the translator, started Puentes Bridges in 2003 as a nonprofit. And so they've planned trips, and now over 150 people over the last 20 years have went on these trips, a few at a time, but about every year or every other year, to visit some of their families or it's not all farmers that have gone, it's some community people that are interested in learning more about their culture, have gotten to know people through churches. So I heard about these trips as we were doing our meetings. Sean would talk about, they'd gone on a trip or they're planning one. So I became interested quite a while ago, but it just never worked to go. Life was busy. My wife and I have had every year, there's a couple of years I'm going to go next year, and then we'd have to get pregnant, going to have a baby. I'm like, well, can't go now. And so finally, kind of the stars aligned. I said, I just got to do this. I just was no matter what, I am going this next February on this next trip. And then we had the pandemic in there, so I think that delayed it another year. Yeah. So finally, February 23, it worked to go. And I was fortunate when on our trip we had a really, really awesome group. There was 3 other dairy farmers and then 4 other kind of community people that weren't directly tied to dairy farms but had known some employees. Or one lady was from Arcadia, Wisconsin, and she was just really interested in their culture and just said, hey, I'd like to go on this trip and just tag along, basically. And it was just an awesome group. You get that big of a group. We had 9 people total then with Mercedes, the translator. You get a larger group, you worry about, the logistics of moving a group around quickly, because we had a lot we wanted to do. We were there for 8 days. In 8 days, a lot of places to see, but it was very well organized and a good group that got along great together. So yeah, so it was a great trip.
Michael, this sounds like it's just an excellent trip and a way to certainly learn more about, the culture of your employees, which I think is really important. Another story you told during your presentation was about the opportunity that you had to actually visit the home of a former employee from your farm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so throughout the trip, we traveled to the mountains in Veracruz, and then later in the trip, the last few days, we traveled to a northern area above Mexico City in the state of Hidalgo. It was a different area than the mountains of Veracruz. It was more of a flat, plateau, arid climate area. But in this area, near the town of Coatepec, is our original employee that I previously talked about, Sasimo. This is actually where he's from. And so it's a rural, very rural setting, not really a town. It's more of a gathering of houses out in a rural area. But they asked us we came to visit them, and they had prepared this huge celebration basically to welcome us and come, and they did this barbacoa, which is a cool thing with food, and they were so welcoming and excited for us to be there. There was, I don't know, maybe 50 people. And for where that gathered was at one of my employees' parents' houses is where the party was, and from that house in that little village, I could probably see 10 to 15 houses from one spot of either former employees or current employees or direct family of employees. So like a large concentration, a very direct tie to our farm, which was just an amazing experience. But one former employee, Ishmael, who worked for us for quite a few years, was living back in Mexico. And talking to him, he introduced his wife to me at the gathering. It was great to see him. I hadn't seen him for quite a few years, so it was just amazing to see him. He had a young son since returning to Mexico, so I got to meet his young son, and then he's got an older daughter. And after talking for a while, he's invited us, hey, can you guys come over and see our house? And then he was really excited to show us his house, and he wanted to show us his parents' house that him and his brothers had helped build his parents' house. And then so we went to his house, and a very beautiful house. And when we walked in, he wanted to make sure everybody that was on the trip from the United States came along, because he was so proud of it. And we walked in the front door, and Ishmael, by the way, too, is a kind of an inspiration, or was really interesting to learn about him. He started his own business when he returned to Mexico, and he owns a taxi business and has some employees that work for him. So that was a cool thing to see. But also, anyway, going back to his house, and we walked in, and he had a nice entryway foyer, and right in the foyer, there was 2 large picture frames with certificates in them, and they kind of stuck out, and they were really almost really fancy. And I looked at them, and I was just shocked. The first one I came to was a certificate from a milker training that we had done on the farm many years ago. But after the training, the company we were working with for training presented every person for completing it with a milker certificate just for completion of the course. And then the one next to it was a certificate of years of employment. And I've given these out over the years, not as regularly as I'd like to, but I tried to, and when we do a Christmas party, give out for how many years of employment did the employee recognize, just a little bit of thanks. And it was something that I probably almost had basically forgotten about, that I'd given it to him. It wasn't a big deal to me at the time, and cost me very little time and energy, money. But walking his house and seeing those certificates was just it just really made me think of those little things that we do back on our farm, just to recognize them, make our employees feel important. It might not mean much to us, but it meant a lot to him. And I didn't realize that until go to Mexico, walk into his house and see them. And then Ishmael was showing everybody's house. He was very proud of it, and talking about how he was able to send his daughter to a nicer school, and he took care of his parents while he was in the United States, and has continued to take care of them as he's returned. But then he started to tell a story of he didn't know what he was going to do with his life, and he'd recently been, when he was younger, he got married, and his wife got pregnant really early, and they didn't really have any money. He had no means to better his life, basically, or he didn't know what he was going to do. He had no real skills. He had no resources to start a business or build a house or do anything like that. So he was really dependent on his parents, who didn't have a lot either. So then he decided to come to the United States. He ended up at our farm, worked for a long time, and then he returned home. But while he was working for us, he built his house, and he put money away. He built his parents a house, and he started telling the story how he had nothing. Where the house sat was a dirt lot, and there was never would have been anything there. He would have never been able to get himself ahead, start his own business if he would never had the opportunity to work on our farm. And it was very emotional. I think everybody that was with us on the trip had some wet eyes, and it was just you could just like the gratitude and like the joy coming out of him was just like oozing. It was one of those moments where it was like I would have never realized the impact it had on him, his family, his community until I was there and like living in the moment.
What a cool story, and the fact that it almost comes full circle, right? So like the impact that he brought to your farm, but then the part you didn't see was the impact that you had not only on him but his family and relatives as well. So yeah, that's a really cool story, and it sounds like a pretty amazing trip. Michael, if you had to pick just a couple of key takeaways from your trip and how you now bring that back to your dairy and turn that into something practical to continue building the culture on your dairy every day, like what are some of those key takeaways from your trip?
One being, just family is important, and I've always known that family is important to them. They talk about it, and that's why they're here, basically sacrificing being able to be with their loved ones so they can improve their family's life. So like obviously family is important, but when we went to Mexico and we saw the older generations taking care of the younger generations, and they supported and lived together, so, like we got asking like, oh, do you have nursing homes, or where's your child care or your daycares? And they were like, it took a while. There was like no word for a nursing home in their language, basically. So we had to it was like, wow, so that really wow, family is important. Like this is a big deal. I've always knew it, but like seeing that and experiencing that there was really big. And then just culture. Food is a big part of their culture, but also like what it means to them to improve their lives and support their elders who have helped them so much, and they take care of each other. And so when I talk with my employees now and they're dealing with something personally at home, before it didn't really affect me all that much, but now I have like this direct tie. I got a picture in my head. It's like, oh yeah, I was there. I visited your parents, and now his dad's in the hospital, and it's just that close, that much more of a connection, I guess, where I can relate to that. And I think we've always worked on a good relations with our employees, and we'd never ask our employees to do something we wouldn't, and just with respect and treat them how we would want to be treated. But now it brought it to a new level, and just a higher respect and friendship for one another, and an understanding. I was born here, and that doesn't make me different or better, but we have different responsibilities and goals in our lives, and understanding what their goals are and seeing things that they've done in their homes and in their communities really brought it full circle.
Yeah, that is some great takeaways, and something I think everybody can learn from.
Grow your skills as a leader and inspire change in your organization. As the speed, uncertainty, and complexity of global markets intensifies, leaders must develop the agility to confront uncertain times by engaging the workforce through vision, understanding, and clarity. What will it take to achieve all this? Well, as part of their brand promise to inspire change and grow leaders, GPS Dairy Consulting hosts a leadership blog on their website, where you'll find numerous articles and video blogs on the topics of innovation, technology, and data, feed fit, herd health and management, team building and employee management, as well as many others. Invest in your business by visiting the blog frequently, and feel free to include other leaders in your network. Read more under the blog tab at gpsdairy.com.
Michael, one of the other things that you talked about was when you were on your trip, seeing about how family members interacted down there when they were doing different activities, and how that can sometimes then correlate back to what you see on your farm when you're asking employees to, for example, take on additional responsibilities. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, when we were in Mexico, we got the opportunity that one family that were planting corn the day we were there, which planting corn there is a little different than planting corn here. And so when we heard they were doing that, we asked them, can you take us to where you're planting? And they were a little hesitant, but finally we talked them into it. And it was a little walk up a hill, because everything there where they were planting is steep and on hills, and everything's planted by hand and seed by seed with a flat hoe. Stick it in, open up a hole, put some seed in, move to the next hole. So that alone there was just amazing to experience and see. And we were there on a special day. They were planting corn on February 2nd, which is a tradition for them. They always plant some corn a little bit on February 2nd, so it's ready for the following January for the Dia de Reyes, which is the Three Kings celebration, January 6th, in their culture. But anyway, so when we were up there visiting them and planting the corn, and we were kind of talking to them, being farmers, we're smelling the dirt and feeling it, and asking them like, do you think about seed, or do you do any, like all these things, and we kind of, as through the conversation, we like, who makes the decision then of like where you're going to plant, or when you're going to do this field, or when you're going to harvest, and they were all there was kind of an older gentleman, I shouldn't say older, but he was the oldest, and there was 3 younger ones. So we thought, for sure he's the boss, and he was like, I don't know, I'm not the boss. And they're like, what do you mean? Nobody's the boss here, and nobody's the leader. And then we kind of pressed them on him, and they're like, well, I guess, if we had to say a leader, Mom's the leader down in the house. She's the boss. We talked a little about that, and then as we were traveling, we were talking, it was interesting to see, like, even in their culture and at home, like they didn't want to put one person or one family member above the other. And it really made me like, wow, it kind of made me think back at home in the parlor, or when I'm working with employees and trying to get one to, hey, I'm gonna promote you to be a shift leader, a manager. And a lot of times we really get a lot of pushback. And it's like, but you're gonna get paid more, you're getting more responsibility, and I believe in you, and you've proved yourself. But still, they're like, no, like, I'm not comfortable, I'm not gonna do that. And I never understood. I was always like, come on, I knew it was like a cultural difference, but I never like got it. But then when we were there seeing that and like being amongst them, and like, we're all good. We don't want to be better than one or the other, right or wrong. It's just different, and so seeing that and understanding back home, like why, it just made me understand or be more empathetic to them when they don't want to go above one another. Like, even if they've been there 10 years longer than a different guy, or they have a lot more experience, they don't want to be, looked at as superior to their relatives or their coworkers. And so that was a good eye-opener for me. It really being able to bring it back home and think about how I interact with my employees when I'm trying to get them to take on a little more responsibility or move into a different position.
Yeah, and that's something we don't often really think about, and I don't know if you would have had the opportunity to learn that if you hadn't, gone on your trip and seen it with your own eyes, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Are there any other ideas that, like, major differences that you see in the cultures that are really important for you when working with your employees?
One big thing that stuck out when we were there, and that a few of the people that we were visiting kind of told us that had been in the United States and worked, and they're back in Mexico now, and they felt a little more, I think some of the people we visited that had worked up here, that for not specifically for my farm, but maybe some of the other farmers that were with us, they felt a little more comfortable or confident to like speak up, but they were giving us kind of a hard time that like, we're so serious, and we're always task orientated, work, everything's work, and like, yeah, maybe we'll take a afternoon off, but we're so focused on like production or productivity, and like, you guys need to relax and have more fun. Like, she's like, you guys don't party enough. We heard that like a few different times, but one lady was really just giving us a hard time about it. And like, I got thinking, like, when we were there, just in like the 8 days, we saw and celebrated with them a couple different festivals, and they were telling us about like, well, just last week we celebrated this holiday, and then we celebrated this person's anniversary, or this person turning 15. Like, all these, like, they have a lot of festivals, and like, they might not have means to like throw like the most expensive, but like they will go above and beyond to provide a really fun atmosphere and food and celebrate, and live bands, and people travel a long ways from out in like the rural villages to come together for a festival. And I just think back to our, like, when we're on the farm, and like, yeah, it is pretty much like always like we need to like work. So, and this isn't just recent, but like, I put a little more focus on is like, we need to celebrate more. Like, too often we're just like, we'll reach some goals or there's a lot of good things. Even when you think there's nothing, you can find something good to celebrate. And, we get outside of the parlor, get outside of the farm, and our guys really like bowling. And so we try to take them bowling at least a couple times a year. And not always, but a lot of times it'll be we'll talk to them about some successes we've had and then at the bowling or whatever, and just to have fun. We've had some parties where we'll have piñatas, because piñatas are a big part of their culture, and almost every time they get together they'll have piñatas. So ours might not be the same, but they enjoyed that. So just trying to have more fun. And sometimes those social outings or the things outside of work, they don't pay back directly, so it's harder, and they're a lot of work, and they're stressful sometimes when we're trying to do all these other things. We're trying to manage kids' schedules and work and everything else we have to do on a farm. So it's not the easiest thing to find the energy for, but every time we do it afterwards, it's like, oh yeah, that's why we do it, because everything, like the mood of the employees, the mood in the parlor, the mood in the farm, like it changes. Like everybody's getting along a little better, everybody's talking a little better, and it's just getting outside of that work environment, having some fun together, and we don't do it enough as farmers, so it's definitely something we can learn from them.
I think that's something we could all have a little bit more of, is a little more fun, right?
Correct, yes.
Well, Michael, it has been great to chat with you. Thank you again for joining us and for speaking at our Leaders Forum this year. We really appreciate it, and I know that the rest of the group got a lot out of this, so thanks again for your time.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to GPS for focusing on employees and cultural relations and taking the time and energy to really hone in on this area.
You just heard from Michael Johnson from Trailside Holsteins in Fountain, Minnesota, as well as GPS Dairy Consulting team member Stephanie Jens. Thank you for listening to the GPS DairyCast, brought to you today from the GPS Leaders Forum. I'm your host, GPS DairyCast host, Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, and thank you for listening.
The GPS DairyCast features conversations that deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders. If this GPS DairyCast has you looking for more ways to become an elite dairy producer, find more information in our show notes on how you can add a GPS advisor to your team.